Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fresh, your host. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. My pleasure to be back with you again this morning, and thanks for taking the time out to listen in. We're going to continue our discussion and reading of the book, The Vatican Billions by Avro Manhattan, a book that shows for us the historical rise of Antichrist. The historical rise of Antichrist. No, Antichrist doesn't come in the future. Antichrist has been with us all along. We're talking about the rising of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly the papacy, its divine right to rule the world, the divine right governor of the world based on the donation of Constantine and the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals. And we've moved on in our discussion about the financial rise of the Roman Catholic Church to that financial colossus that it is today, outstripping that of entire nations. Many people tell me, Tom, the Roman Catholic Church can't run anything, it doesn't have the money. Well, we're dispelling the myth with real facts of history. Remember, the Roman Catholic Church is nigh on to 1,700 years old now. It outlasts all of her enemies. And she has put her time to good use, and one of the best uses of her time has been to discover how she can gather in all the riches of the world. Now, the papacy was known as a money-grubbing monster. And we're talking particularly about the period of time in the Roman Catholic Church and the rise of the monastic orders. Many of them begun by monks, poor, destitute monks who had stripped themselves of any earthly possession, mostly out of protest against their own church for being so preoccupied with the gathering of temporal riches. And first we talked about St. Francis, the founder of the Franciscan orders. Now we're talking about St. Bernard of Clairvaux, also of France. And he fulminated again and again against a religious system, his own Catholic Church, with a voracious appetite for earthly goods, accusing her of worshiping mammon instead of God. He spared neither priests, bishops, nor even the popes. In his Apologia, he attacked, quote, excessively rich prelates, unquote. In his treatise on customs and duties of bishops, he thundered against bishops who, quote, grew fat on the revenues of bishoprics, unquote. He did not hesitate to castigate the papal legates themselves, quote, those rapacious men who would sacrifice the health of the people for the gold of Spain, unquote, going so far as to declare that the Roman Curia was nothing but a den of thieves, unquote. And as we ended the broadcast last time, I equated this Roman Catholic den of thieves as the Gentile version of that den of thieves that Christ renounced. The religious leaders of his day, whited sepulchres, religious thieves, a den of thieves. And now we have the Gentile equivalent, the Roman Catholic Church. And it says he even compared any pope who took pride in his office and riches to a monkey, quote, perched high on a treetop, unquote. This, although the pope of that period had formerly been one of his monks and lived like him a most austere life. St. Bernard did not spare the church. He was also a ruthless denouncer of heretics. Okay? He was a renouncer of heretics. Here's the Laodicean character, the Nicolaitan character of the Roman Catholic Church. Religious persecution. The Roman Catholic Church decided what was heresy, and they condemned heretics to death. And this St. Bernard, who condemned the money-grubbing tendency of his church, was also an extirpator of heretics. And it says many he had arrested and imprisoned. So here is a priest of the Roman Catholic Church, a monk of the Benedictine order, who was arresting and imprisoning and killing heretics. And it says hundreds were pitifully burned at the stake in public squares. St. Bernard became the terror of any dissenter. The Roman Catholic Church turned him into another tool to strengthen herself in matters of this world, that is, in wealth. For she, the Roman Catholic Church, saw in the denunciation of heretics yet another important source of revenue. St. Bernard had not been the first. He was one of many in a series of extirpators. But he gave a renewed impetus to the practice, since with the increase of varied heresies and even more varied measures to suppress them, we're talking about torture. Today we call it enhanced interrogation procedures. It says the very profitable method of expropriating their property and levying crushing fines came increasingly to the fore. So the motive now is not the suppression of heresy. Suppression of heresy is an excuse to gain riches for the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church claimed that the property of heretics must be confiscated by the Church. The property of heretics must be confiscated by the Church. And it says, thus, the burning of heretics soon brought with it two visible benefits: the elimination of dangerous, devil-inspired people, and the addition of ever-increasing wealth to the Roman Catholic Church. It says, from the sporadic denunciations of the early periods and the relatively mild punishments that followed, a time came when the charge of heresy transformed the ecclesiastical structures, that is, the Roman Catholic priesthood, into a ponderous and terrifying machinery at the service of fanatical or corrupt monks and prelates. No one was safe from its tentacles. It could crush the humblest dwellers in the poorest burg, or the mightiest head of any clan, be he in the wilderness of Scotland, or a prince of Sicily, Portugal, or Germany, with equally arrogant ease. In other words, there was no escape from the Roman Catholic Church. They were everywhere. They had this vast web of control. Priests controlling the secular government through the dioceses. The diocesan priests held excommunicatory power over the kings of the earth. And they went about using the secular power on pain and threat of excommunication to round up these heretics and try them and put them to death and to confiscate their properties. So we have a union of church and state persecuting the people and stealing their property. Now, bishops and cardinals themselves were not immune. This became so because the desire to preserve the faith in all its purity, the concern of monks, ultimately became so intertwined with greed from wealth in anonymous denunciators that in the long run the two became inseparable. So it came to pass that the fulminations of the popes, for instance, launching anathemas, interdicts, or excommunications, in addition to arrest, torture, there's those enhanced interrogation procedures, and the death penalty, led also to the expropriation of all the goods, money, and property of those who had been denounced. So if you've been denounced as a heretic, you're not only toast, but everything you own in this world is confiscated by the Roman Catholic Church. Quite a racket. And it says this became a source of untold wealth for prelates, bishops, and popes who practiced or pretended orthodoxy, so that very often no one knew with certainty whether the accused had been arrested because of their deviation from the faith or because of greed for their wealth on the part of their anonymous denunciators. That's right, anonymous denunciators. You know, if you wanted to ingratiate yourself to the Roman Catholic Church, you wanted to get in good with the priest, You could clandestinely report your neighbor as being a heretic. You might even gain some of the wealth from his extirpation and confiscation of his goods. So your worst enemy might be your next door neighbor, or even worse, a member of your own family. You could anonymously accuse someone of heresy, and your identity would remain a secret. And it says the authorities, lay or ecclesiastical, were compelled under pain of excommunication. Now we're talking about the civil authorities, lay or ecclesiastical, either the church authorities or the civil power, were compelled under pain of excommunication, that's eternal damnation, quote, to seize all the heretic's property, goods, lands, and chattels, to arrest him and throw him into prison, unquote. So I'm telling you, if you live during this period of time, you best behave. You better not be found to be a heretic by anybody, even your worst enemy, because he could secretly go to the priest, turn you in, and merely for no other gain than to get rid of you and to ingratiate himself to the priest so that he would never be found to be a heretic. Doing favors for the church to protect yourself. That's why God said the enemies will be members of your own family. Your worst enemies will be members of your own family. This is a fulfillment of that. Now, Pope Innocent III issued specific instructions concerning this. The Corpus Juris, or the body of law, the official law book of the papacy, gave details. Quote, the possessions of heretics are to be confiscated. In the church's territories, they are to go to the church's treasury, unquote. And what territory was not under the church's dominion? Well, if there were any, they weren't long to last. Because the Pope, according to the donation of Constantine, owns the whole world and everything that's in it. Now, this papal injunction was carried out everywhere the Roman Catholic institution ruled. Thus, for instance, following the edict to the authorities of Nimes and Narbonne in 1228, Blanche of Castile ordered that any person who had been excommunicated, quote, shall be forced to seek absolution by the seizure of all of his property, unquote. So if you were found guilty of heresy and you wanted to absolve yourself, you had to forfeit all of your property. Okay? This order became so general that in a collection of laws known as the establishment, I want you to, you ever hear the word establishment used? Who are the establishment? We're going to find out right here. This is a papal document called establishment. Okay? This order became so general that in a collection of laws known as the establishment, it is commanded that royal officers, that is, officers of the civil power, the police, the justice of the peace, the mayor, the law of the civil power, whenever summoned by the bishops, that's the bishops, the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, whenever the royal officers, the civil power was summoned by the Roman Catholic bishops, here's that shadow government, the diocesan priest, shall seize both the accused and his property. So we have the shadow government, the bishops, hiding under a cloak of religion, controlling the civil power, and the civil power, at the behest of the Roman Catholic bishop, went out and seized both the heretic and his property. That's why you never want to foster an idea of a union of church and state. Because wherever the church has control over the state, this is what you get. Religious persecution. Now, this is why we have a wall of separation, the separation clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution, to prevent the Pope from ever controlling the civil power in this country. But they've overridden that by putting devout Roman Catholics, traditional Tridentine Roman Catholics, in the most powerful offices in this country. And that's why our Constitution is not highly regarded. It's ignored in our government. And we see eminent domain, the stealing of private property for public use. Well, who is the governor of the civil power, the public? The civil government. And they are controlled by the bishops in their dioceses. And they seize property. Do we see the equivalent of this today? And we could do a whole show on this. But I leave it to my listeners to think, what is the modern equivalent of these historical realities? Union of church and state, a shadow government, confiscation of property, imprisonment of heretics. I haven't said anything about it for a good long time. But I defended Tony Alamo. I defended Tony Alamo, a Christian ministry in Falk, Arkansas. I've been widely criticized for my support of Tony Alamo because few people look into the facts of what really happened at Tony Alamo Christian Ministries. But he denounced the papacy just like I do. Having never met the man, I knew he was telling the truth. And they raided his church, put him in prison, convicted him of bogus charges, and now they're going after the church property. Now the state is going after the church property to put all the people in that ministry out on the streets without jobs. People who have dedicated their lives to the service of the Lord in a worldwide print ministry. What we've seen in this book took place against Tony Alamo Christian Ministries. Now, completely apart of what you think personally about Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, certainly you can see what happened to Tony Alamo Christian Ministries as being a mirror image of what took place in the heyday of the papacy, when they controlled the civil power, when the bishop of each diocese controlled the civil power and went about imprisoning the people and confiscating their property. And in the case of Tony Alamo, the first property they took were their children. And what did they do with the children? Gave them inoculations against the moral conscience of that ministry. And then they put them in the secular schools. Our corrupt school system took them out of their godly schools right there on the ministry and put them in public schools to corrupt their minds, to Romanize them. The crime that was committed against Tony Alamo Christian Ministries goes on to this day, and no outcry from God's people. And so it goes. And so it will continue until God's people wake up and are willing to embrace the truth. Now, sundry French kings eventually enacted similar decrees. Philip III and Louis X, for instance, church councils did the same. Popes strengthened them. To mention one example, the Pontiff of 1363 ordered that any heretic, quote, should be arrested, imprisoned, and all of his property seized. When Pope Honorius crowned Emperor Frederick II in 1220, he hurled a solemn excommunication against anyone, quote, infringing the privileges of the church, unquote. What was the privilege of the church? To condemn heretics and to steal their property. If you got in the way of that process, you were in deep trouble. Now, he declared that, among others, quote, bishops could the shadow government, bishops could excommunicate any prince or secular ruler who refused to persecute heretics, unquote. In other words, if you work for the federal government and you want to keep your job, you best persecute the heretics. So says the bishop, the shadow government. Now, they were to be reported to the Pope himself, who these secular powers, if they were disobedient and didn't preserve the liberties of the church and persecute the heretics and confiscate their wealth, they were to be reported to the Pope himself, who would then, quote, deprive them of their ranks. In other words, they'd lose their job or lose their rank. They would deprive them of their rank, power, civil liberties, followed by seizure of all their temporal possessions. In other words, they could be treated like a heretic themselves. So you better believe the secular power obeyed the bishop. If they didn't want to be treated like a heretic themselves, then they better get on their horse and go about the diocese and arrest all the heretics and confiscate all their property for the church. Now it says, thanks to such decrees, the church could obtain vast estates and substantial wealth merely by accusing a rich man of heresy. This practice was not, however, confined to wealthy individuals. As it became more common, it degenerated to such an extent that it was turned into the most blatant pretext for collecting money, often in connivance with secular rulers. So now you have a close bedstead relationship between the secular power and the Roman Catholic priesthood, and theft is the name of the game. It says, to cite only one case, witnessed the regent Blanche of Castile, who in 1228, besides, as already mentioned, decreeing the seizure of any heretic's property, ordered that, quote, to quicken the process, a fine of 10 livres would be exacted on all those excommunicated who had not entered the church within 40 days. So there's your forced proselytization of the Roman Catholic Church. You had 40 days to enter the Roman Catholic Church. And it says the clergy, high and low, then began to practice another money-extracting device. They forced the faithful, when these were beyond reproach and could not be accused of heresy, to purchase escape from excommunication. You don't want to be excommunicated? Then give us money. That's extortion. It's theft. Okay? It says this yielded tremendous sums to the clergy throughout Christendom. Prelates, cardinals, popes used their position to make money, not only for the church, but also for themselves. Bishops became notorious for their greed. There was the case of the Bishop of Syphalog, for instance. The bishop excommunicated his king. The bishop excommunicated his king. There's the church excommunicating the civil power. And it says when the latter asked for excommunication to be lifted, the bishop agreed, but at a price. This price? A plate of pure gold the size of the bishop's face. And they tell me the Roman Catholic Church is poor. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't have the power or the influence to be the biblical Antichrist. Well, let me tell you, we've just gotten started in this book. Now, returning to the book, here's the bishop, excommunicated his king, and in order for the king to get his excommunication lifted, had to pay a price. And what was the price? A plate of pure gold the size of the bishop's face. It's a good thing he didn't ask for one the size of the bishop's belly. Probably couldn't afford that one. Look, we're just getting started here, but already we can see how the Roman Catholic Church controlled the secular power and how it used the secular power, the government, the king, the court, the police, to seize the property of anyone the church deemed to be a heretic. You talk about a racket. You know, any of us, virtually any of us, if we sat down and thought about it, could come up with about at least a dozen names of money-grubbing televangelists. You know, all those who stole the money of their parishioners to build fancy theme parks and crystal cathedrals and humongous churches and buying up property and Learjets. We could name at least a dozen of them. Money-grubbing televangelists. But what one of us ever discusses this? Where the Roman Catholic Church used the government to amass vast tracts of land, castles, gold, precious stones, pearls, and the souls of the people. We never talk about that, do we? Now, I'm not excusing the money-grubbing evangelical televangelists. I'm not excusing them at all. I make no excuse for them. They're just beginning to show their true roots as being the daughters of this harlot we call the Roman Catholic Church, the harlot that God calls the Roman Catholic Church in Revelation chapter 17. The lineage is just becoming apparent. But at no time in history has the evangelical or Protestant churches ever had control of the secular power to confiscate land. But the Roman Catholic Church has. Now, wouldn't our time be a little bit better spent understanding where this money-grubbing attitude comes from? You say it's not politically correct to talk about these sorts of things. Well, it's politically correct to talk about Jim Bakker. It's politically correct to talk about any of these money-grubbing televangelists. And the truth ought to be told about them. God's people ought to be about justice. But why is the Roman Catholic Church the biggest money-grubbing organization on the planet, in the history of the world, untouchable? It's just not politically correct. Well, you'll find no political correctness here at Inquisition Update. Now it says, besides such trivia for extracting money, more serious abuses became common practice. Thus, for example, if during a quarrel one single drop of blood was shed in a cemetery, an interdict was automatically proclaimed. The latter was not lifted, that is, the interdict was not lifted unless the people collected the sum of money demanded by the clergy. Refusal to pay meant that the corpses for which the necessary fine had not been paid were dug up and thrown off consecrated ground. If a priest were killed, a whole district could be put under an interdict until the crime had been paid for with money or its equivalent in goods. Greed for money went even further. The clergy began to excommunicate the neighborhood of the man who had been originally excommunicated. This with the specific objective of seizing properties concerned. In other words, we'll just condemn the whole neighborhood until they find a solution and pay the fine. You talk about abuse of power? It says the anathemas, interdicts, and excommunications employed by popes, cardinals, bishops, the minority clergy, for motives of the basest avarice became so frequent, so widespread, and so scandalous that many genuinely religious individuals, no less than lay authorities, began openly to revolt against the abuse. Why wouldn't we revolt in this country? Because we simply don't understand that the same power that abused its privilege, abused its power back then, is the same one that abuses its power today through the federal government, through the federal and state government. Nothing has changed. The papacy has had 800 years to perfect this system and to make it hard to recognize unless you do you read your Bible and history. It says the scandal was not confined to any limited period or country. It became universal, and it lasted for centuries. Indeed, with the passing of time, the greed for worldly riches ultimately permeated the whole system to such an extent that the cry at the Diet of Nuremberg, uttered in 1522, expressed the anguish of countless individuals throughout Christendom. Quote, multitudes of Christians are driven to desperation whenever their properties are confiscated, thus causing the utter destruction of their bodies no less than their souls. Unquote. The verdict at the Diet of Nuremberg was not a gross exaggeration. It was a most accurate assessment of the Roman Catholic Church's insatiable thirst for the riches of this world. We need a Diet of Nuremberg in this country. We need to uncover the Vatican's control of our government. We are taxed to death. Why? Because the Jesuit order through the Rothschild banking dynasty of Europe runs the Federal Reserve Bank. And they are the ones who print the money to loan to our government at extreme interest. And with that money, our federal government fights papal proxy wars, not wars for the benefit of the people of this country, but wars to help conquer the world for the Pope. And we, every April 15th, go to the post office to pay our taxes to cover this debt. Now, they were wise at the Diet of Nuremberg, and they accused the papacy of bringing them from riches to rags. But the American people are silent. They don't even know who the criminal is. It's the same one. It's just a different century. Same crime, just a different century. You pay your taxes? What do your taxes buy you? War. And who do we fight the wars for? The Pope. We need a Diet of Nuremberg in this country. A new Protestant Reformation. We need to uncover the bedstead relationship between our government and the Roman Catholic Church. For any of us to think that the same system that existed, that we're reading about, that existed in the world, the Roman Catholic Church control of the civil power, does not exist today, is simply willfully ignorant. Now, chapter 7 of this book is entitled Pay to be a Christian. Pay to be a Christian, whether alive or dead. It says, at the close of the first millennium A.D., the accumulation of wealth by the Roman Catholic Church had been carried out in a somewhat haphazard fashion, since, apart from the extensive territorial gifts which she had received from sundry kings during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, her wealth had grown mostly thanks to the piety of her members. From the 10th and 11th centuries, however, the accretion of her riches gathered momentum. That is, it became systematized. It became a part of the Roman Catholic system. Do we have a system in this country? You suppose it might be a Roman Catholic system? I assert unequivocally that it is. And it says, indeed, it became a fixed feature of the Roman Catholic Church's administration. Whereas in the past the money had come from the humble and the poor who donated because of religious motives, from now onward such quote-unquote donations became compulsory. Mandatory. So that it's not donation anymore, is it? What is it? It's taxation. Now, it was no longer the humble folk or the princes who gave for quote-unquote favors received. Henceforward, they were all made to give for favors not yet received. That is, they had to give to the church by the mere fact that they were members. The principle being that the children who were cared for by the mother, in other words, the people cared for by the Roman Catholic Church, should give her part of their riches as compensation for her love. See, see how they've twisted this? And it says the tenet was not new. Its novelty was that now it became systematized, an integral part and parcel of the Vatican's vast money-grubbing machinery. The popes were anything but slow to incorporate the practice in the expanding structures of ecclesiasticism. In other words, this system grew out of ecclesiasticism, priestcraft. Okay, they promoted well-planned money-collecting operations throughout Christendom, directing them from the top down. And it says the most notorious of these pontiffs, these popes, and one of the first creators of the Caesaro-papism, the Caesaro, if you want to pronounce it that way, Caesaro-papism. Now, let's talk about that term. It's a new one. We haven't heard it in this book. Who is Caesar? The secular power, right? And who is the papacy? The religious power. So we have a civil and religious union. The union of church and state. Now, it says again, the most notorious of these popes and one of the first creators of Caesaro-papism, that is the union of church and state, as it was rightly labeled, Caesaro-papism, was Pope Gregory VII, who in 1081 gave orders to his legates in France that every house inhabited by a baptized person, that is a Roman Catholic, in that country, should pay an annual tribute of 1 denarius to the Blessed Peter. Okay? How did the Pope justify such a monetary injunction? Or to be more precise, taxation? Once more, by virtue of the most rewarding of all letters, that missive which the Blessed Peter wrote with his golden pen to Pepin. For, said Gregory, a yearly donation to the Blessed Peter, that is, to the Pope, was an ancient custom first imposed by the son of Pepin the Short, whom we've already encountered, that is, the Emperor Charlemagne, who, having overcome the ferocious Saxons, had offered his territories to St. Peter and hence to his successors. Anyone inhabiting the territories thus donated, therefore, was duty-bound to give such contributions, because, explained Pope Gregory VII, using the appropriate feudal juridical terms of the times, he, Pope Gregory, considered France and Saxony as belonging to the Blessed Peter. As a result, the denarius which every one of the inhabitants gave was nothing less than a fealty contribution to the Holy See, an argument which was eventually to be confirmed and practiced by subsequent popes, such as Gregory IX, Innocent III, and others, Pope Martin IV, for instance. So if you were a baptized member of any of these lands conquered for the Pope, then he had the right to tax you. Now, what lands don't belong to the Pope? Well, according to the donation of Constantine, all lands belong to the Pope. So where do your tax dollars go? You think it too much of me to say that your tax dollars benefit the papacy? I'd like somebody to prove that in error. It says Martin interdicted King Pedro of Aragon after that king claimed his hereditary right to Sicily following Sicily's rising in 1282 against King Charles. Martin, using the papacy's immense spiritual pressure, deprived King Pedro of his kingdom. Thereupon, what did the Pope do? He presented the whole kingdom to somebody else, namely to Charles of Valois, but on one important condition. There's always a catch with the papacy, right? It says Charles had to pay a yearly tribute to the coffers of the Blessed Peter, that is, of the papacy. So if you get on a line and you don't tax the people and pay the Pope, you lose your kingdom, and the Pope gives your kingdom to somebody else. And then the taxes are collected for the papacy. And it says Pope Clement IV in 1265 had done even better. He had, in fact, sold millions of South Italians. He had sold millions of South Italians to Charles of Anjou for a yearly tribute of 800 ounces of gold. Again, to the Blessed Peter's holy coffins. Neglect of payment, carrying with it, of course, excommunication and interdict, and all that they implied. Kind of reminds you again of Revelation chapter 18, where it talks about all the things that the papacy buys and sells by her vessels and ships by sea. It includes the souls of men, doesn't it? That list includes the souls of men. Here we have Pope Clement XIV selling millions of South Italians to Charles of Anjou for a yearly tribute of 800 ounces of gold a year. Prophecy fulfilled. Pope Sixtus IV very often caused a notice to be nailed to the door of churches. When the clergy and the faithful went to see what the papal message was, they discovered that unless a certain sum of money was forthcoming at once, that church would be under an interdict, and furthermore, that its clergy would be suspended. This financial expedient proved abundantly productive for other popes and hierarchs for long periods. Such measures, although frequent, were not, of course, sufficiently methodical to yield a regular and steady income. Hence the creation of regulations, the enforcement of which resulted in a steady flow of riches to St. Peter's coffers. Some of the most common were the quote-unquote oblations, or offerings at Mass during certain feast days. These oblations were at first voluntary. With the passing of time, however, they became a kind of unwritten contribution to the clergy, until in the 13th century they were insisted upon as a right. The canonical tenets which the clergy invoked for their justification were those implying that if an ancient custom is honorable and praiseworthy, it acquires the binding force of law. And what habit could be more praiseworthy than that of faith, that the faithful should offer the Lord some of their money for his apostle, his vicar on earth, the Pope? This custom eventually became so widespread that the clergy treated the collection of oblations not only as a duty on the part of their parishioners, but as a right of the clergy, to such an extent that ultimately the oblations were extorted from the faithful with the utmost disregard, indeed with such cynicism that many councils attempted to check the hierarchy's rapacity. This came about when it was discovered that many priests were putting pressure to bear even in the confessional. They were using the confessional box to extort money. You confess your sins to a priest, and to obtain absolution for your sins, which the whole scheme is diabolical. It's never authorized in the Scriptures whatsoever. We're to confess our sins to Christ, to the Father, in Christ's name, for our forgiveness of sins. It's His blood that redeems us from our sin and the penalty from sin. But the Roman Catholic Church is told that they are to confess their sins to a priest, who then may extort money from you for absolution. They were even using the confessional for this. And it says, in fact, round about 1210, church councils were compelled to inflict penalties on some of their clergy who had gone so far as to refuse to administer the sacrament to those who had not given their oblation or who were in arrears with their Easter offerings. That's right. They were even refused the sacrament, the host, the Eucharist, which is all important to a Roman Catholic. That is when they take the consecrated wafer from the priest, they are eating Jesus, and Jesus becomes a part of them, and that is the means by which grace is infused into the penitent Roman Catholic. It's an entirely diabolical misrepresentation of the gospel. It puts Christ out of the picture and puts the priest in his place. It's idolatry. It's another sacrifice, another gospel, but yet the people so believe it that they would give up their goods, give up their livelihoods to maintain the sacrament. So the priest simply, if you want me to give you Jesus, if you want me to give you the Eucharist, if you want to participate in the Mass, you have to pay the price. Money. And it says the result was not only growing resentment, but also avoidance of payment. Many, so as not to pay the oblations, began to stay away from Mass. The clergy retorted by making it punishable for them to do so. And I've read accounts where they were denied their pensions if they failed to show up to Mass on Sunday. And that was just for the first offense. For the second offense, they were denied their pensions for a great period of time, and then they were whipped. And the third time, they were killed and their property confiscated. That's what happened to some who tried to stay away from the Mass, to try to avoid this extortion. And it says, indeed, they fined their own parishioners if the latter frequented churches in other parishes. If the latter frequented churches in other parishes. In other words, if they wanted to avoid, some of them would go off to other churches. And if found out, they were punished. And it says, fines were enforced on those who omitted confessions or communion at Christmas and Easter, for instance, upon those who neglected church fasts. The higher clergy also imposed fines both upon lay folk and the lower clergy for every act of immorality, a system which became the cause of frequent extortion by unscrupulous high prelates. The immorality of the clergyman having thus been turned into a regular and constant source of revenue for those above. We're just getting started. The money-gathering mechanisms systematized in the Roman Catholic Church are legion, and that's what this book is about. And when we're done, you will know who rules this world and by what means they do it. And it's all cloaked in the name of Christ. It's an abomination. It is not Christianity. It is Catholicism.